Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Haas, it is a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I wanted to have you back on for the anniversary of Fred Hampton's assassination. December 4th, I'll be posting this episode, and I wanted to get your interaction and meeting with Fred Hampton. Your perspective, your thoughts at the time you met him, and then also your perspective and thoughts on him now.
Well, okay. I think we go back to Chicago in the 60s. I had graduated from law school there, taken a job at Legal Aid, working mostly with groups in the Black community to try to build low income housing. Uh, this was the late 60s in Chicago. There was a lot happening there and around the world. You'd had the Democratic Convention in 68. That was disrupted by the anti-war movement. You had Dr. King, who had come to Chicago to try to break down some of the segregation that was there. The anti-war movement was strong. There was a lot of civil rights activity. A Puerto Rican group called the Young Lords had changed from being a gang to a group that had fought urban renewal. And there was a lot politically going on in Chicago and in the rest of the world. And one of the things that was happening is in 1966 in Oakland, a group of people, particularly Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, started the Black Panther Party to raise the issue of the treatment of Black people, but also demand their freedom and to basically take on many of the issues that face the Black community, including poverty, including police brutality, including lack of medical care. And so they had started in Oakland in 1966. And in 1968 in Chicago, there was a young Black man named Fred Hampton, whose family had moved to Chicago from Louisiana in the 40s. Fred grew up in a working class suburb of Chicago. He was recognized even in high school as a leader. He had led a walkout when Black girls were not allowed to be considered for homecoming queens, and also to get more Black administrators and Black teachers at the high school he went to. He was recognized and became the head of the suburban NAACP in Chicago, and it grew under his leadership. So at this point, I had heard about this young dynamic person named Fred Hampton, and he met another lawyer that I knew in Chicago named Dennis Cunningham. And Dennis had represented Fred after Fred had led a march to the Maywood City Council demanding a swimming pool because there was no place where Black kids could swim in the summertime unless they bused or took a car or something into Chicago. All the suburban pools were private and did not allow Black kids. So Fred and this Dennis led a demo. And when they got to the city council actually used tear gas and refused to meet with them. And then Fred, some of the kids who weren't allowed in broke some windows leaving. And then they ended up charging Fred and the dentist with mob action for supposedly inciting a riot. So early on, Fred was a leader. He was demanding things for the Black community. And he was also being targeted by the police. And as we learned later, the federal government, because he was a powerful young man. He was a very, very good speaker. And he just had a magnetic personality that drew people to him. And so as he grew in stature and he was able to reach everything from law students to college students to welfare mothers, he became more and more popular. And when Stokely Carmichael came to Chicago, Fred introduced him. And Stokely Carmichael said that this is a brilliant young leader. And when the Panthers started in Chicago in the fall of 1968, Fred was made the chairman of the Black Panther Party. At that time, he was all of 20 years old. So he was already an important figure. The lawyer I knew, Dennis Cunningham, represented Fred in that case of mob action and won, and Fred was freed. And Dennis and Fred said, we're starting a Panther chapter here, and we need people's lawyers. Every time we go out in the streets to sell a newspaper, we get busted or charged with resisting arrest. We go to a demonstration and the police target us. And so Fred had an influence on Dennis, who came to me and two other lawyers. And we, in the summer of 1969, we started the People's Law Office. And it was a lot in order to represent the movement, which was the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, people arrested at the Democratic Convention, the Young Lords, and many other groups.
Could I ask, Fred was very charismatic, but have you listened to his speeches? I mean, they range kind of wildly. Some that I don't know if it was because of his way that he was able to guess talk to the people that he was speaking to and really adopt or adapt to the climate of his audience, but it's pretty powerful stuff.
It's very powerful. And there's sort of an interesting backstory is that Fred had a sort of a speech defect when he was younger. And so he would practice his elocution and he memorized some of the speeches of Malcolm X and Dr. King so that he overcame this speech defect intentionally. And as in addition to being a great speaker, he was also known as the King of the Nines in Chicago. Like you didn't take him on even in just friendly jousting. But you're right. His ability, his presentation, the ability to move people, as I said, various types of audiences, various people with different kinds of education, white people, black people, brown people, all there was this magnetic energy about Fred, youthful energy, buoyancy, optimism in a certain way, and urgency. And I don't know, he combined those things in his talks. And he had also, as I said, he had picked up the cadence. And so when he gave that famous talk, I'm not going to die slipping on a piece of ice. I'm going to die fighting in the revolution. Why don't you? Or I'm going to live in the revolution. I think Fred always backed up his words with actions. So when he would say to comrades in a party, show up for the breakfast program on time. You have to be there at 6 o'clock. We have to make the food. We have to serve the food. We have to meet the parents. But Fred, or sell your quota of papers. So Fred didn't just tell people there. He'd be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, making the breakfast, playing with the kids, whatever. So he always backed up what he was asking other people to do with his own life. And as you said, he was fearless. And yeah, he was he was a very powerful, sometimes a rhetorical speaker, sometimes a funny speaker. One of those speeches. He says, "Black power to black people, brown power to brown people," and he went through the whole sort of list, and then he said, "And X power to any people I left out." But anyway, he had a sense of humor about it sometimes too that added a dimension to his talks.
Now, when he was forming the chapter in Chicago, how hands-on was he with obviously everything that was going on, or did he have other members that were assisting him in the process?
Well, definitely I mean, because he was such a good organizer that he could motivate other people. So he spent time. And so Doc Satchel became head of the free medical program. And Lynn French became one of the main people in the breakfast program. And other people were in charge of the newspapers. And there was political education classes. And so Fred was always trying to get people to take on more responsibility. And one of the things I think that I heard later from many of the women members was particularly promoting women to be leaders in many ways and to be spokespeople for the Black Panther Party. And no, he wasn't perfect. And as one Panther woman said, we didn't get the Panther brothers from heaven, but in many ways, Fred promoted, I think, women's leadership and refused to, in some occasion, actually allow Panther women to be used in just a sexual way. And so he had a great deal of respect for people. So, but he would, he would go to the Young Lords and he would go to the Young Patriots, an Appalachian white group in Uptown, people who had left West Virginia and Kentucky and had Confederate flags in their caps, but also were suffering from urban renewal, from poverty, from poor housing and police brutality, and see the commonality in with these people, and eventually get them to take the Confederate flag out of their hats, but basically build a coalition. And I think it was his growing power in meeting people and energizing people that made him such a threat to the government.
You know what happened with him in the Weather Underground?
It was a mixed relationship. Both the SDS, the national headquarters of SDS was on Madison Street, and they had a printer, and the Panthers were on West Madison Street, and they often used the printer of the Weather Underground, and generally they were comrades and worked together in the Weather Underground. I know that there's a famous speech when the Weather Underground in October of 1969 said, called for the days of rage, in which they said, we're going to come to Chicago and take on the police. And Fred Hampton thought that was suicidal and spoke out against it. And that speech was, widely publicized. On the other hand, there are many other times when he said the SDS Weather Underground are our allies here, and we rely on them, and they do support us. So it was a mixed bag. It was a heavy time. And so they did have a difference of agreement around that. But I don't think generally, I think probably he got as much support from the SDS, the weather people, and of course SDS had split into factions that summer in 1969. But so there was a lot of support, and then there was some very strong disagreement, and Fred spoke out against the days of rage, and generally his prediction that these were not as many people came as were expected, and they got their butts kicked by the police and picked up criminal records. And their idea was to open a second force so to relieve the police pressure on the Panthers. I personally don't believe it had an effect. I think the Panthers were going to be targeted whether or not whatever that Weather Underground did. But anyway, those were some of the issues that were being discussed in 1969.
Do you think that Fred Hampton changed the way the Black Panther Party was either viewed or the way that they were going? It seemed like he had more of a, not, I wouldn't say, I mean, yeah, balanced approach. Seemed like he was able to talk people down from extremes, whether it was his group or not. I mean, he knew situations and battles that he could win and which ones that seemed like a loss.
Yeah, I think he was very strategic, but he was also very militant. And also the Panthers had some pretty heavy rhetoric, you know. And I think to them, off the pig meant get the police who are attacking us out of the community. And maybe to the police, that meant, well, they were all out to kill us. And so, Fred sometimes picked up on that rhetoric. But I don't think it was Fred had the ability to organize many people around many issues, and so he could see through things. And so, the common need to take on police brutality, the common need to deal with the issue of prisons and just education, and the health and the medical clinic and the breakfast program. I think Fred. He added the rhetorical flair and of the Panthers to very humane, real programs and a very magnanimous personality and generous personality. So that's who I think Fred was, and he really had the ability to move people. My law partner Flint Taylor took him to the Northwestern Law School, to a standing room crowd, and people loved to hear him. So I just think he was very talented, and he could speak to different groups in different ways, but nevertheless was very conscious of where they were at and how to move them. And I think he was just so full of energy. I remember when I went 2 days before December 4th of 1969, I went to the Panther office because we were there in the process of buying it because they'd been attacked by the police and the FBI in 3 different raids in 69. And so they were buying the building because they were being evicted. And so I went over there and got to Fred to sign some papers. But here he was just like, as I wrote my book, the Assassination of Fred Hampton, he was sort of like a modern day rapper, telling the Panthers, show up for the breakfast program on time, sell your quota of newspapers, this, and they were back and forth, and they would get energy from him. So he was like running it, and yet with an energy that he himself wasn't running it. And you go do something that I wouldn't do. I'll be there with you. This is what we all have to do.
Can I ask more about the free breakfast program? Fred's Hampton's involvement in that?
Yeah. Well, like in many cities, and it started in Oakland, black kids, there were many black kids who went to school hungry in Chicago, and there was no public breakfast or food program at the schools. So the Panthers saw this as a way to reach out and talk to people in the community and feed their children. So they started with one at the boys' club, and later on they had several, I think 5 or 6 breakfast programs in different parts of the black community. And they would go early in the morning, and sometimes at churches, sometimes at community groups, at the boys' club, and they would solicit contributions from grocery stores, from other people. So they would get the food, and then they would make the food and serve it to the kids before school, meet their parents, And one of Fred's thing was, well, I know some of these mothers don't necessarily agree or with socialism, but they sure like seeing their kids being fed their breakfast. And there's pictures of Fred playing with the kids and pictures of him serving the food just like everybody else did. When you became a Panther, you had an obligation to participate in these community programs, whether it was selling newspapers, whether it was going to education classes or breakfast program. This young medical student, Doc Satchel, became the head of the medical clinic in Chicago. So it was partly a service organization as well as a political organization.
Can I ask when Chicago police saw, I guess, could you explain maybe them with the Black Panthers when that first happened, like when their first interactions and when the violence started kicking up, or Fred Hampton's, when did he pop up on Chicago police's radar? That's not from the Good Humor incident, is it?
Well, it did start in Maywood, and he did become a target of the police because of the demonstrations he organized there. He also was accused. There was a ice cream vendor in the middle school across the street from where Fred lived. And while they were selling ice cream, somebody came in and held the vendor down and passed out ice cream bars to some kids. And Fred came from across the street to see what was happening. And the police came, and I think with their help, the vendor identified Fred as the person who had supposedly robbed him. So they charged Fred with armed robbery. Um, this was in 1968, but he went to trial in 69. We did not represent him in the trial, but represented him on appeal. And it was a case that should have been handled as a misdemeanor. He had no record. There was no personal injury. Property damage was $51. I think that was the value of the ice cream that was supposedly handed out. And but he was charged with robbery. And the judge at the end of the trial, before sentencing, said, "Well, I'm going to give him probation," but of course he had to wait for a sentencing report. And we had a very ambitious prosecutor in Chicago who was the heir to then Mayor Daley. And Hanrahan had declared war on gangs, declared that gang members were animals. And he, to advance his political career, had also declared the Panthers were nothing but a gang. So somehow he reached the judge. And so when sentencing came, Fred got 2 to 5 years in the Illinois penitentiary and was sent down there. At that point, he hired, we represented him on appeal and got him out on appeal bond in August of '69. And he came back at that time, and there was just a huge welcoming for him at the People's Church. And that's where he gave that speech, which has been recounted. Fortunately, there was a group that was already doing a documentary on Fred before he was killed, and they were present that night and took down that speech. And I was present with my law partner, Flint Taylor, and heard this man speak, that, and he was really powerful and uncompromising, and said, you know, uh, power, power for you, or peace for you if you're willing to fight for it. Dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't struggle, you don't deserve to win. And he said, I don't want myself on your mind if you're not going to do no revolutionary act. Don't be thinking about me. And so it was a very powerful speech. And of course, at the end of that speech, he said, this was in August of 1969, I'm not going to die. I'm slipping on a piece of ice. I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to die of the People's Revolution. And why don't you live in the revolution and die in the revolution? I hope we all can live in the People's Revolution. And, and of course, people were standing and listening to this man. And of course, very much like Dr. King, it was barely 3 months later that Fred was assassinated on December 4th, 1969. But he had the room, and that was my first real encounter with Fred, seeing him, hearing him. And at that point, I had not decided whether I wanted to be a people's lawyer or wanted to be a traditional lawyer. My dad was a lawyer in Atlanta, and I had an opportunity to go back and see him. And in the middle of that speech, I'm sitting there with Flint nodding generally. And Fred said to the people in the audience, now everybody stand up. And we stood up, and he said, now raise your hand, right hand, and, like this. And I did. And then he said, repeat after me. I am. And I said, I am. And then he said, a revolutionary. And I couldn't say it. The words like stuck in my throat. But he repeated it and repeated it. And by the fourth or fifth time, I guess I was shouting with my fist raised, I'm a revolutionary, as loud as everybody else. And I think it was a threshold that he took me and many others in that room over. All of a sudden, well, who are you? Are you a lawyer for the movement, or are you part of the movement who is a lawyer? And that was my personal take on listening to Fred. And after that speech, in almost the same month, Dennis had found a couple other people, and we started the People's Law Office in Chicago, representing the Panthers, among others.
Thank God you chose that over the legal route.
Yeah. And anyway, yeah. And Fred had told Dennis, I always wanted to be a lawyer. I don't think there's enough time. And there was an urgency about Fred, and there was an urgency about the '60s. Like, we're facing this war in Vietnam. We want to support the civil rights movement. What is this country that was supposedly founded on all these principles is dropping napalm on Vietnamese? And, Black people are living in a way, inhuman conditions in many cities and not being helped. And of course, in the South, the law was, the law segregated Black people. In the North, the actual the reality separated Black people. Chicago was a very segregated city.
Can I ask when Fred Hampton got on the radar of the FBI and people that are higher up intelligence agencies of the government?
He was put on a national list as early as '68, before about the time, even before the Panthers started. I think because of his ability to uh, draw people and move people, he very early was put on their list. We learned this later in the civil suit. Of course, they didn't make it public, but he was a target early on of both the Chicago police and the national FBI's, at that time, secret COINTELPRO program.
And when did they contact O'Neill? Do you know how they got about getting O'Neill as an informant?
The Panthers opened their office in Chicago in November of 1968. About, that they publicly started their office. About that time, this young black man, William O'Neill, was charged with car theft or taking a car across state lines, a federal crime. And when he was arrested, he showed a law enforcement badge. And to many people, somehow this FBI agent questioned O'Neill and offered him in exchange for not prosecuting him that he should go and enter the Black Panther Party as an informant. And so within a month of the opening of the office in November, William O'Neill walked in and pretended or did join the Black Panther Party. He was recruited by Mitchell, and he was told basically to report on what was going on. But O'Neill had his own particular, I guess, personality traits. He was sort of a street-wise guy, and he also was a thief in the sense that he was a burglar and he would stick up people. And he even continued doing that when he was in the Panthers and encouraged other Panthers to do that. I think whether that was his own thing or whether that was the FBI's effort to target the Panthers, or the FBI knew he was still doing these criminal acts and they didn't prosecute him for him. But O'Neill had a unique sort of street sense. He endeared himself in the party. He had the ability to fix things. So frequently after the office was raided, he would make the repairs. And so for a while, he had some credibility in the party. He actually was, for a very short time, Fred's bodyguard. And so the FBI was hearing, and then O'Neill would, of course, like to puff himself. So he would exaggerate on the information he gave the FBI, telling them stories about the Panthers, some of which had no basis, but made him appear more valuable as an informant. And so he could get more money from the FBI because he was supposedly giving them credible information.
And even after the raid, he got a $300 bonus.
That was one of the most, in every law case, there's sometimes what we call a smoking gun. Or after the raid, well, not only did he got a $300 bonus, not just for being an informant in the party, but at the request of his supervisor or his control agent, he went in and got a floor plan of the apartment where Fred and his fiancee, Deborah Johnson, were living together with other Panthers. And so he got a floor plan that showed all the rooms, even the furniture, and above the bed where Fred and Deborah slept was a bed where Hampton and Johnson sleep with an arrow on it. That floor plan was given by the FBI to the Chicago police, and they had that floor plan with them on the morning of December 4th at 4:30 when they raided Fred Hampton's apartment. And as you said, subsequently, O'Neill was given a bonus and an internal document that said, the information from you could not have been obtained from any other source. It was of huge value. I guess the value was that they killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark that morning.
Can I ask more about the raid and the people that suffered also that might not get talked about? Obviously, Mark Clark and Fred Hampton lost their lives, but other people were injured as well too. That raid was a mess, and I don't think really people get to soak up the gravity of it until you watch the video and see the photos.
Right. Well, I was on the morning of December 4th, 69. my law partner, Skip Andrews, as I said, I just seen Fred 2 days before and was supposed to meet him the next day to finish the purchase of the Panther office. But Skip woke me up in 6 in the morning and said, the chairman's been killed. There was a police raid this morning. He was already in a suit and tie, and I couldn't believe it, that this person who seemed bigger than life, I was now told that he was dead and killed by the police. So I went to while Skip went to the apartment, which the police had left open, and also to the morgue with Fred's family to identify Fred. I went to the jail where 3 of the people in the raid who had not been killed or not been shot were at the local police station. And just how this unfolded to me was I interviewed Deborah Johnson, who was Fred's fiance, 8 months pregnant with their later born son, Fred Jr. She was in a nightgown. She could see she was very pregnant. And they brought her into the interview room, and she was in tears, and I said who I was and how could I help her, and what happened. And she just looked at me and said, well, the police came in firing, and they were shooting and shooting, and our bed was, you could feel the bed where we were sleeping, the bullets hitting the bed. But Fred didn't wake up, and I tried to rouse him, and it was very loud, and he sort of half lifted his head up and then put it back down. And then she said, and then the police came, pull me out of the bedroom, to plainclothes police in plain clothes with handguns. They pulled me out of the bedroom. Fred, at that point, there was no blood on me. Fred was alive. And I heard one of the undercover police say, is he dead yet? And I heard 2 shots. And then the other one said, well, he's good and dead now. And the bed, of course, eventually with all of Fred's blood, was left there by the police that morning. So she gave me a clue of what it was like. There were 2 other Panthers who were in there also, who told me their stories. They had been woken up by a knock on the door. Who's there? And then following that, never an announcement by the police, just the police broke in the door and they just heard firing. And there were several times when the firing ceased, but then the police continued. And, they described a fire, looks like a lot of bullets. And they had seen Mark Clark was sitting by the front door. He was security. And he was killed by a bullet, probably through the front door. And the only evidence of any shot by any Panther was his shotgun shot was fired into the ceiling in the hallway, which we think was a reflex after he was hit. And, he didn't fire. It was an involuntary shot. Now, we heard about the shooting. We heard about them going room to room. Meanwhile, my other law partners were at the apartment, and the police left it open. The police instead went on TV and said they were serving a search warrant. Panthers opened fire. I remember them saying, there but the grace of God goes I. None of the police were injured, strangely enough, although the Panthers opened fire supposedly. And Skip and Flint and other people, Skip Andrew had the sense to bring a minister and a filmmaker into the apartment that morning. And they filmed it as they saw it when they walked in, including the blood on the bed, blood on the floor. And Deborah had told me that after he was killed, they dragged Fred's body out like into the hallway from the bedroom. And it was like their trophy. It was sort of like a trophy kill for them. And then as we learned later, and as Skip said, 4 Panthers were in the hospital. And so I didn't go see them. I didn't they were subsequently seen. And the worst person, well, because as I said, Mark had a fatal shot. He was killed. Fred did die. The autopsy showed 2 bullets to the head at close range, in parallel, totally consistent with what Deborah reported to me. It was assassination. Doc Satchel had several 45 caliber bullets in his colon and in his intestines. And one of the raiders, Gorman, took a 45 caliber machine gun on the raid and fired from the front living room through into the 2 bedrooms. And there were 3 people in the first bedroom, one of whom was Doc Satchel. So he was hurt the most. They had to do surgery on him. He lost part of his colon, and Doc never completely recovered. I mean, he was a very slim, thin guy, and he had 4 bullet holes in his stomach going up and down. And I don't think his health never really came back. Brenda Harris, who was in the living room, she was shot in the hand. Blair Anderson was shot in the groin. And one other Panther was Verlina Brewer, who was a 15-year-old from Ann Arbor. She was also shot. So all of these, and then the 3 people who weren't shot, Deborah and the 2 Panthers in the room with her, they were beaten up, made to lie on the floor, and listened to the police who were celebrating the murder of Fred Hampton. And they were all charged then. After the raid, the police claimed, we didn't know it was a Panther crib, but they took all of their personal weapons, pistols. One took a 30 carbine, one took a 45 caliber machine gun, and they were claiming they didn't know it was a Panther apartment. They were surprised, but they didn't go in there with that kind of weaponry. Obviously, they knew it was a Panther apartment, and they went in shooting. So, among other things, the evidence, we gathered the evidence. We got an expert there. There were bullet holes, and we put these wooden dowels through them, and you can tell the direction of a bullet from the entry on one side of a wall to the exit. The entry hole is smaller, and the wood is splayed outward in the exit hole. So we put towels in there, and it showed all the bullets came from the direction of the police, except the one shot into the hall ceiling. And many of the bullets were aimed at the bed where the floor plan had shown Fred and Deborah were sleeping. And actually, one of the striking pieces of evidence was a reporter happened to be listening to the police radio and heard about the raid and went to the site of the raid. And as he went there, the 4 police were carrying Fred's body out on a stretcher, and they were all smiling. And that photograph sort of depicted the police attitude toward Fred.
They're still unidentified to this day, right? Nobody's been able to identify those cops that were pulling out Fred Hampton's body.
I'm not sure. I mean, they were not the shooters. They were because they were in uniform. And I don't know to what extent. I can't remember whether we identified them or not, actually.
Do you know why Fred didn't wake up? I know we've talked about it before, but was that on the basis of the second autopsy the family had done, that they found something in his system?
Yes. It was very strange that from the get-go, Fred and Deborah and the other 2 Panthers said Fred didn't wake up. Or he woke up and rose halfway off the couch and went back to sleep. When a first autopsy was done by the officials in Cook County, and they didn't find, they found the bullet wounds consistent with what Deborah said, but they didn't find anything other than in his system. Subsequently, the FBI, when we had a private autopsy, they found a very high level of secobarbital in Fred's body. Fred didn't take or use drugs, but it was an amount that would put one to sleep and make it very difficult to wake up. And that's really the only explanation we have of why Fred didn't wake up the morning was somebody spiked his Kool-Aid or his orange juice the night before. Uh, O'Neill was there that night and left. He's a possible suspect. Uh, so we haven't ever gotten an admission as to how that secobarbital was got in his blood. The FBI did a third autopsy and they claimed they didn't find any secobarbital, but then that was months later, and that whether it would have disappeared or dissolved or whatever it was also a question. So who did it? And we don't have uh, clear proof of how that secobarbital got in his system.
What did Hanrahan do during the trial when all this was being brought up?
Well, like I said, Hanrahan, I think he thought Hanrahan was the heir apparent to Daley. He was from the same Irish neighborhood, from Bridgeport. He went to Harvard. He had been a U.S. attorney. Now he was the prosecutor, the state's attorney.
Wait, Richard Daley?
What?
Richard Daley?
Yeah, the original Richard Daley.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a bad guy right there.
Yeah, he ran the city, the boss. And Hanrahan came from the same Irish neighborhood and was being groomed and was going to be he was the heir apparent to the original Mayor Daley. And he was politically ambitious. And so after the raid, I think he thought killing a Panther would make his political career. So he holds a press conference 3 hours after the raid at 9 a.m, and he has the Panther weapons. They did find Panther weapons there, most of which, if not all, were legally purchased. But they just put out on a table these weapons that they found in the apartment. And one of the cops claimed, well, I saw Fred Hampton shot at me from the back bedroom. And so Hanrahan went with this whole story. And one of the other cops said, well, the woman on the couch, Mayor Brenda Harris, opened up on me as I came in the front door with a shotgun, 2 shotgun firings. And the crime lab in Chicago had miraculously found that those 2 shotgun shells came from a Panther weapon, or so they claimed. So our gathering so Hanrahan was talking about how lucky it was that the people and the cops who did the raid were assigned to his office. He had there was a gang intelligence unit, but that wasn't enough. So Hanrahan had a special prosecution unit set up to do political cases. And so the 14 men from who were police officers, but they were assigned to Hanrahan. So he was taking credit for the raid and talking about how lucky it was that none of the police were injured, and it was this terrible firefight and they were caught off guard. And one of the things and we were meanwhile gathering the evidence and talking to the victims who were survivors, and they said, no, it was a shoot in, not a shootout. And Hanrahan said, well, prove it. And he had an exclusive in the Chicago Tribune with a photograph that showed 2 black dots by the back door. And he said, well, he gave him that photograph and said, that's the evidence that Fred Hampton fired at the cops coming in the back. So we were there at the scene, and we brought a reporter out there and said, look at this. And those 2 black dots were nail heads. They weren't bullet holes. And with that, Hanrahan's whole version began to come apart. And we brought it, and the FBI eventually brought in a firearms identification expert and said those 2 shotgun shells were from a police weapon, not from Brenda Harris's shotgun. And the police still stuck with their story that she fired this shotgun twice at them, but amazingly, nothing ever came out of the gun because there was no wall and nothing with shotgun pellets in it. So they eventually dropped the case against the Panthers because the lab evidence that Brenda had fired was false, and the evidence that Fred had fired from the back door was false, and they couldn't prove attempted murder. Nevertheless, Fanny Clark, Mark's mother, Mark came from Peoria, was a sort of a rising young leader there. And of course, I've described Fred Hampton were killed. Doc Satchel was really injured in a way that he never completely recovered, and the other people had injuries to their legs or to their groin or to their hands that has caused them some some physical problems. I think the mental trauma to all of them, including to Deborah, of waking up. I mean, Deborah saw her fiance executed or witnessed it basically, and her son was born posthumously. So I think the experience for all of them shaped their lives. I don't think in 69 we knew enough about post traumatic stress to probably give them or have them, get some kind of help or therapy for it. So it very much affected the rest of their lives.
Do they get any damages covered or anything like that? I mean, I know that doesn't take away of losing a life of a loved one, but it's just anything that at least gets another investigation so we can at least get it mentioned that obviously COINTELPRO was very active and it was a high part of this program. I mean, in their document states preventing the rise of a black messiah. I mean, if anything, Hoover's credibility is just diminished from all these years of all these documents, but I'm just hoping something for the family at least can get some type of closure.
When they dropped the charges in April of 70, uh, that was good. But then what kind of justice was that? And so the family, the survivors and the families, Fred's mother and Mark's mother in particular, came and said, and we talked to them and said, well, we want to file a civil suit. We want to sue the raiders, the crime lab, the phony investigation under a conspiracy that they all conspired together both to murder Fred or to cover up the murder. And so we filed a civil suit in federal court. We were young lawyers. We'd never really been in federal court. We got support from some of the old stalwarts of the National Lawyers Guild. And that suit, which we filed in 1970, went on for 13 years. And it was through that suit that we got discovery. And everything we got, they didn't just turn over, but one of the major things we got was a U.S. attorney who didn't want to be, this was Watergate period, and he didn't want to be accused of destroying documents. He turned over the floor plan. And the floor plan we discovered was written by O'Neill and his control agent, Roy Mitchell. And it showed all these things. And we took depositions, and the FBI said, well, we got this floor plan, and we gave it to the police. And they had it with them when they went on the raid. And the direction of the bullets was very much towards the bed where Fred and Deborah were sleeping. So that was sort of the first smoking gun of FBI. And so no one knew when, in 1969, the clandestine COINTELPRO program started by Hoover, targeting the entire black movement. They attempted to blackmail Dr. King. And it was aimed at the black movement in particular. And they talked about the need to neutralize and destroy the Black Panther Party by any means necessary, prevent them from forming coalitions with groups, discredit them. And this discovery of this program came about because there was a burglary of the FBI office outside Philadelphia. Some people were looking to destroy draft records and came across these documents that were marked COINTELPRO. And so they began to question it, and the church committee was formed after Watergate to investigate illegal actions. So we worked with them, but we also got our own discovery. And what we discovered was one of the COINTELPRO mandates was prevent the rise of a Black Messiah who could unify and electrify the Black masses. And they mentioned that Stokely Carmichael could have been such a person, and Malcolm X, except he had been killed by that point. And so we also got documents showed that the head of the FBI in Chicago had tried to set up an assassination attempt on Fred by the Blackstone Rangers. he had sent a letter to Jeff Fort, and the Blackstone Rangers on the south side of Chicago were the most powerful, most well-armed gang. And that's another thing that a little bit of this history was why Fred was such a threat to the police and maybe to the power structure is Fred sought a truce among the gangs, among the Blackstone Rangers and the disciples. And he had made some progress about getting the gangs not to prey on the community, but to try to serve the community. They actually joined some boycotts of unions that wouldn't hire black workers. And so Fred had the ability, I can't say that he succeeded. The disciples said, all right, you can organize in our territory. And Jeff Fort, head of the Rangers, said, well, you can come in our territory if you want to share the dope proceeds. And Fred said, no, we're not going to do that. But he reached out to them and had made some efforts and had some success in forming a truce with the gangs in Chicago. Anyway, Hanrahan wanted to rise his political career on demeaning gang members and law and order. And so when his story fell apart, his whole credibility, none of the stories about the Panthers firing were supported by the physical evidence at the scene. And we traced the direction of all the bullet holes. And we estimated between 90 and 99 shots were fired by the police, and the only shot fired by the Panthers was from Mark Clark's weapon. But when we started the suit, we didn't know about COINTELPRO. And when we got it and asked for documents, they refused and they delayed. Many of them didn't come out till the trial. We had a very racist old judge from Alabama. When it finally went to trial, we had an 18-month trial. And while the jury was deliberating, the judge dismissed the case, saying there wasn't enough evidence to go to the jury. And it was only because we got a reversal on appeal and a new trial that they eventually settled, and we got $1.85 million for the combination of the survivors and the survivors who were injured, and also the families of Fred and Mark. It was I think publicly what happened became well known. I think Mayor Daley, who had ruled with a very controlling all the black representatives and alder people were followed the party line and were very much controlled by Daley. After Fred was killed, the black community, which had mixed reactions to some of the Panthers, did not accept that a young 21-year-old could be murdered in his bed at 4:30 in the morning. So it had a big effect in terms of leading to the independence of black political figures in Chicago, aldermen, U.S. House representatives, and it was formed a coalition between sort of liberal whites and the black community that eventually got Harold Washington elected the first black mayor in Chicago. So it had far-reaching political consequences. Also, however, the loss of a dynamic leader like Fred, I think, led to more drugs, more gangs, and more violence on the West Side because there weren't alternatives, or alternative people were shot or were put in jail.
Could I ask what your thoughts are when it's the anniversary, December 4th, and what you want people to remember about Fred Hampton?
Well, I think one of the messages is the government kills, and it did, and it covered it up, and it was part of a program. And as you mentioned, the people who'd carried it out were rewarded for it. Their careers, either within the FBI, they had Marlon Johnson, who had signed off on these hit letters. What he had sent it to Jeff Fort was saying, Panthers have a hit out on you. I know what I'd do if I were you. He eventually became head of the police board in Chicago. And as you mentioned, O'Neill got several bonuses. And we also learned later that when the FBI announced they had a floor plan and sent it up the chain of command, Hoover and his associates, closest to people, were following very closely what was going on in Chicago and signed off on some of these documents. Unfortunately, we were not allowed to add Hoover initially, and he passed away before we ever took his deposition. And we weren't allowed to add John Mitchell and Nixon's U.S. attorney. But what did the White House know, and when did they know it? I think about the loss of a beautiful, powerful figure who represented revolutionary change and dared to struggle. And I think seeing that has affected my life in the sense of wanting to commit myself to supporting people and groups and organizations and movements fighting for justice. And I think remembering him as somebody, as a symbol of that, sometimes when the case got tough, 13 years and being thrown out of court, being held in contempt, we sort of said, well, what would Fred do? He wouldn't give up. And so I think he stands as a beacon, as somebody who didn't give up, who spoke the truth. The critical times like now, somebody like that stands out. And I think there's sort of a bond among people, me and my law partners, but me and the former Panthers, and among everybody who knew Fred, has something very much in common. And we uncovered a minister who had worked in Chicago who sort of took Fred under his wing when he was still in high school, and he still spoke about what a huge influence Fred had on him, and how he'd set Fred up to speak throughout the city of Chicago. So it's a reminder of what both the government can do and did, and it's a reminder of an amazing young man whose potential was cut short when he was murdered in his bed at age 21.
Mr. Haas, you've given me enough of your time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah. Well, I wrote the book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, How the FBI and Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther. So you can buy that in any bookstore, local bookstore, on Amazon. And I document a lot, the documents that we had. And I tried to write it ended up going back to graduate school and getting an MFA in creative nonfiction to make it sort of a memoir, to tell the story as I and others around me experienced it, not as a legal brief. So I think, and as I mentioned, a movie was being made about Fred when he was killed. And the movie is called The Murder of Fred Hampton. You can get it, I think, on YouTube. And it shows Fred, and it shows that amazing speech that we talked about, because they were, they were viewing it all. They were filming it at that time. So, and there are various other books about Fred Hampton. I mean, you can look at him up, about the Rainbow Coalition that he formed. And of course, my book include many references that I used, and many documents that I relied on and included in the book.
Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you again, Mr. Haas. I really appreciate the time. And thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.